with jobs, relationships, and responsibilities. But what hurt most wasn't the lack of time, it was the lack of effort. A letter, a proper phone call, a visit once in a while. These weren't impossible things, yet they rarely happened. Birthdays became particularly telling. I used to wake up excited on my birthday, knowing they would come over, maybe even with a homemade cake, or at least a card filled with scribbles of love. But in recent years, it became just another day. Sometimes, I'd get a text, hurried and impersonal, "Happy birthday, Grandad. Hope it's a good one." Other times, nothing at all, until days later, when one of them would remember out of guilt. I never said anything. I didn't want to sound like a bitter old man, but inside, the silence echoed louder than anything else. Christmases were the hardest. Margaret adored Christmas. She'd decorate the house with garlands, set the table with her best china, and spend hours cooking. For a few years after she passed, the grandchildren kept up the tradition with me. We'd eat too much, laugh too loud, and I would sit quietly for a moment, thanking whatever higher power might be listening that I still had them. But slowly, those gatherings dwindled. Daniel spent one Christmas abroad, networking as he called it. Sophie and her partner started splitting their holidays between his family and what little time they had left. Michael once sent me a postcard from Sydney, writing, "Sorry, I couldn't be there. Grandad, sun's out, oceans, bloomery Christmas." I smiled when I read it, but later that night, I sat by the fire alone, listening to the crackle of the wood and feeling the emptiness of the room around me. The distance wasn't just physical, it was emotional. Conversations became shorter, more transactional. I would ask them how they were doing, and they'd give quick, surface-level answers. If I pressed deeper, there was always the sense they were in a rush to get off the phone. And slowly, painfully, I began to feel like a burden rather than a blessing in their lives. I sometimes wonder if they see me as nothing more than an old man waiting to die, someone whose only remaining value lies in what he might leave behind. That thought alone is enough to break a heart, because I remember a time when I was their whole world, when my stories made their eyes light up, when my hugs healed their scrapes, when my presence was enough to make them feel safe. To go from that to being an afterthought, it's a kind of grief all on its own. One particular memory still stings. A few years back, I invited them all for Sunday dinner. I cooked Margaret's famous roast beef recipe, even though it was far too much for me to manage alone. I spent the whole day preparing, setting the table, polishing the silverware, even buying their favorite puddings. Only Sophie came, rushing in late, with paint still on her hands, and apologizing for not being able to stay long. Daniel texted that work had kept him too busy. Michael never replied at all. After Sophie left, I sat at the table staring at the untouched plates, the candles burning down into stubs. I told myself never to go to such lengths again. It was too much hope for too little return. The distance grew not just in miles, but in meaning. I realized, slowly and painfully, that I was no longer at the center of their lives. I was on the edges, fading into the background, like a photograph left too long in the sun. And while part of me wanted to shout, to demand they remember the man who had always been there for them, another part of me simply grew tired. Tired of asking, tired of waiting, tired of hoping. Yet, even with all this, I could never stop loving them. They were my grandchildren, my blood, my Margaret's legacy. But I couldn't shake the creeping suspicion that their love for me had changed. It wasn't the pure, innocent affection of their childhood anymore. It felt conditional, measured, and though I hated to admit, it's rooted more in what I could give than in who I was. That was the distance that grew with time. Not just space, not just silence, but something deeper, a shift that made me question whether I mattered to them at all. And though I didn't know it then, that creeping doubt would soon be confirmed in a way that pierced me more deeply than I could have imagined. For a time, I convinced myself that the growing distance between my grandchildren and me was simply part of life. People get busy, schedules clash, and families scatter. That's what I told myself, over and over, whenever the silence of my house grew too loud. But then came the visits, the sudden appearances at my doorstep that carried with them an unfamiliar weight, the kind that left me unsettled long after they had gone. It started with Daniel. He arrived one Saturday morning, dressed immaculately as always, in a navy suit that looked as though it had never known a crease. His car, a shiny new BMW, was parked just outside, its engine still ticking from the drive up from London. He hugged me, Yes, but it was quick, perfunctory, almost like he was ticking off a box. We sat at the table, and within minutes the conversation shifted. He spoke of how stressful his job had become, how cutthroat the London market was, and how he needed to make sure he stayed ahead. I listened, nodding politely, but I could feel it coming, the request. Sure enough, it arrived cloaked in charm. "Grandad," I was thinking, "there's an investment opportunity. Just a small loan, really. It would help me secure my position at the firm. I'll pay you back, of course." The words stung more than I let on. I gave him the money. Of course I did. I've always been generous with my family, but as he drove away later that afternoon, without even staying for the dinner I had cooked, I realized I couldn't remember the last time he had visited without needing something. That was the first time I wondered if love could sour into something transactional. Not long after, Sophie began to appear as well. At first, I was overjoyed. She had always been the grandchild closest to me, my little artist, the one who once curled up next to me on the sofa sketching while I read. So when she knocked on my door one rainy evening, arms full of canvases and brushes, I welcomed her in with open arms. She chatted cheerfully, but eventually her words turned. "Grandad," she said, setting her mug of tea down with a careful clink, "I've found the perfect studio space in Manchester. It's everything I've ever dreamed of. But the rent? Well, it's more than I can handle right now." She looked at me then, her eyes wide and pleading, the same eyes that once begged for an extra biscuit before bed. I wanted to believe. Her visit was about me, about missing me, but deep down I knew. Still, I agreed to help, telling myself it was what Margaret would have done. Michael was the boldest of them all. He didn't bother with small talk or gentle requests. One afternoon, he burst into the house, full of energy, telling me about a new business idea. He had a cafe that would revolutionize the way people experienced coffee. He spoke with the kind of wild confidence only the young can muster. And then, just as quickly, he asked if I could help fund it. "Grandad, it's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You'll see. We'll both make money from it." I didn't tell him that I had no interest in making money at my age. What use is wealth when your days are already numbered? I gave him what I could, though less than he wanted. He left disappointed, though he tried to mask it with a grin. That grin, once the source of so much joy, felt hollow now, stretched thin by expectation. Each visit left me emptier than the one before. What once felt like love and connection now carried the sharp edge of obligation. They came not to share in my life, not to sit with me in my loneliness, but to take pieces of what I had left. I began to dread the sound of the doorbell. I would hear it echo through the hallway and wonder not which grandchild has come to see me. But what will they want this time? The worst part was the pretense. They would arrive with hugs and smiles, with stories of their lives, but I could see the calculation behind their eyes. The conversations always turned, inevitably, toward money, property, or the future. "Grandad, you've done so well for yourself. Grandad, you must have savings tucked away. Grandad, you won't have to worry about it much longer." Those words chilled me more than they realized. I tried to brush it off, to remind myself that maybe they were simply careless with their phrasing, but in my heart, I knew better. Their visits weren't about me, they were about what I represented. To them, I was no longer the man who carried them on his shoulders at the fair, or taught them to ride their bikes in Roundhay Park. I had become, instead, an inheritance waiting to happen. One evening, after Sophie left with an envelope of money for her studio rent, I sat in the living room and stared at Margaret's old photograph on the mantelpiece. I spoke aloud, as though she were there. "Margaret, is this what we raised them for? Did we fail somehow? Or is this just the way of the world now?" Her picture, of course, gave no answer, but I could almost hear her voice, soft and steady. "Love them anyway, Elaine, even when it hurts." And hurt it did, because each visit left me torn between two truths: the love I still carried for them, and the undeniable feeling that I was being used. They had stopped seeing me as a grandfather, a man with memories and feelings. To them, I was an account, to be drawn from, a safety net they assumed would never fray. The loneliness of those visits was worse than the loneliness of silence. Silence, I could manage it, was predictable, steady, even bearable with a good book or a walk through Leeds Market. But to sit across from the people I loved most, to look into their eyes and feel invisible, that was a wound that never...
They thought my fortune was guaranteed to be theirs. But when the will was read, the truth shattered everything. Blood may tie us together, but loyalty decides who inherits it all. My name is Elaine Walker, and I have lived most of my 78 years here in Leeds, a city that has grown alongside me, though not always in ways I recognize anymore. People sometimes find it odd that a man carries the name Elaine. It was my mother's choice, and she was stubborn enough never to change it despite all the teasing I endured in school. Over time, I wore it as a badge of honor. It became part of who I am, part of the life story I carry, and at my age, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Leeds has always been my anchor. I was born here, raised here, and, except for a short stint of work in Manchester in my 20s, I never left. I worked for decades as a postman, waking before the sun, sorting letters in the cold, and walking the same streets that now feel quieter and lonelier than they ever did when I was young. Back then, I knew every face behind the doors I knocked on. I carried not just mail, but news, postcards from faraway places, birthday cards stuffed with love, and sometimes even the dreaded bills that made people sigh. Still, it was work with purpose. Now, the faces are different, the doors unfamiliar, and the streets echo with silence I can't quite escape. I lost my wife, Margaret, 12 years ago. She was my compass, the heart of every decision I made. Margaret had a laugh that filled our modest brick house in Beeston with warmth, the kind of laugh that could rescue me from the darkest of moods. She loved flowers, daffodils in particular, and every spring, she would plant rows of them along our little garden path. Even now, when they bloom, I feel her presence, as though she's reminding me not to let go of life completely, no matter how heavy my heart feels. But truth be told, the house feels empty without her. The kettle still whistles every morning, but no one waits at the table across from me anymore. My 3 grandchildren, Daniel, Sophie, and Michael, are, on paper, the reason I keep pushing forward. Daniel, the eldest, is 30 now. He was once a boy who used to chase pigeons in Millennium Square with such glee that strangers stopped to watch. Sophie, 27, was my little artist, forever scribbling on any scrap of paper she could find. Michael, the youngest, at 24, was cheeky but charming, the kind of child who could get away with anything simply by flashing a grin. They were the light of my life, especially after Margaret's passing. In the early years, they visited often. Sundays were sacred. Roast dinners at my house, laughter echoing through the walls, stories spilling out like the gravy Sophie used to pour too generously over her potatoes. They would run into my arms as soon as they stepped through the door, and I, in turn, would spoil them with stories about my younger days, tales of postman mischief, or anecdotes about Margaret's stubborn streak. They loved hearing about how their grandmother once chased a goose through Roundhay Park because it had stolen her sandwich. Those days were golden. But time has a way of slipping through your fingers, doesn't it? Children grow, priorities shift. Visits that were once weekly became monthly, then yearly, and finally, they became nothing more than hurried phone calls, or worse, no calls at all. At first, I told myself it was natural. They had lives of their own, careers, relationships, ambitions that carried them far from Leeds. Daniel moved to London to work in finance. Sophie pursued her art degree in Edinburgh, then later settled in Manchester. Michael, never one for structure, drifted about, trying his hand at different jobs, from cafe work in Birmingham to a short-lived internship in New York. I didn't begrudge them their journeys. How could I? Life is meant to be lived boldly when you are young. I only wished they would still remember that the man who once tied their shoelaces, bought them ice creams from the van on Bridgate, and carried them on his shoulders at the fair in Roundhay Park, still lived here, waiting for a knock on the door. These days, my life in Leeds is quiet to quiet, if I'm honest. My mornings are slow. I make tea, watch the news on BBC, and sometimes take a stroll through the market just to hear voices, even if they aren't directed at me. The market stalls smell of spices and fresh bread, and I often pause to buy a small loaf I don't really need, only because it gives me a reason to exchange a word or two with the baker. In the afternoons, I sit by the window with a book or a crossword puzzle. The radio hums in the background, though most of the time I'm not really listening. I suppose it's more for company than anything else. When my grandchildren were younger, I never imagined I would end up this lonely. I pictured a retirement filled with family gatherings, noisy Christmases, and summers where the grandchildren brought their own children back to Leeds, filling the house once more with chaos and joy. Instead, the only footsteps I hear most evenings are my own. Sometimes, though, the phone rings. It's almost always one of the grandchildren. And while I should be grateful for their voices, I can't help but notice a pattern. The calls come with requests money for rent, help with a down payment, or a contribution toward some ambitious plan. I always oblige, because what else can a grandfather do? But I can feel the difference. The warmth is gone, replaced with a polite obligation. At night, when the house is at its quietest, I find myself thinking about Margaret. I wonder if she would be disappointed in the way things have turned out, or if she would tell me to stop being so hard on the children. She always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Love them anyway, she used to say, even when it hurts. I try, Margaret, I really do. But sometimes, the hurt weighs heavier than the love. Leeds remains a city full of life. The students, the shoppers, the buses rushing through the streets. There's movement everywhere. Yet I often feel invisible, like a ghost wandering through places that once brimmed with meaning. I walk past the old post office, now turned into a modern cafe, and remember the days when it was my second home. I stroll by the park where I taught Daniel to ride his bike, and I hear echoes of his laughter. Though the benches are empty now, the city moves forward, as does the world. But I remain rooted to a house that feels more like a museum of my memories than a home. This is my quiet life in Leeds. It is steady, predictable, and laced with both fond recollections and piercing silences. Yet, as I sit here telling you this, I know the story doesn't end with loneliness. Because, as you will soon hear, what started as a life of being overlooked by those I loved most would lead to a revelation none of them expected. When I look back now, it feels almost impossible to pinpoint the exact moment when the distance began to grow between my grandchildren and me. Was it a slow drift, like a boat quietly pulling away from its moorings without anyone noticing? Or was there a particular day when the connection simply snapped? I suppose it was both small, unnoticed moments building up until one day I realized the closeness we once had was gone. After Margaret passed, those 3 children were my saving grace. They came often, filling the house with laughter, mischief, and the sweet chaos that only young people can bring. Daniel would help me mow the lawn, though he never did it properly, leaving strips of grass uncut because he grew bored halfway through. Sophie would set up her paints in the kitchen, ignoring my warnings about the mess, while Michael ran around with his football, leaving muddy shoe prints on the carpet. It was noisy, it was messy, but it was life, and I clung to it desperately because it reminded me I wasn't alone. But life has its way of pulling people in different directions. Daniel was the first to drift, always ambitious. He was talking about making it big in London before he had even finished his A-levels. I remember driving down to visit him in his first flat in Canary Wharf, a cramped, boxy place that smelled perpetually of takeaway food. He was proud, though, beaming as he showed me the skyline from his tiny balcony. He promised he'd visit more often, that he'd come back to Leeds on weekends when he wasn't too busy with clients. Those weekends grew fewer and fewer until they stopped altogether. The calls became shorter, clipped by the constant buzz of his phone and his need to jump into a meeting. Sophie, sweet Sophie, held on the longest. She would send me little sketches by post when she was away at university in Edinburgh. Drawings of old buildings she thought I'd appreciate, or funny caricatures of me with my spectacles sliding down my nose. I treasured those. They made me feel remembered. But even Sophie began to fade. Once she settled in Manchester with her partner, the visits slowed. She'd call now and then, her voice full of apologies. "Granddad, I'll come up soon, I promise. Life's just so hectic, right?" Now, she meant it. I believe that. But good intentions can't fill an empty chair at the dinner table. Michael was always different. He had no plan, no real direction, but he was always chasing something, an idea, a dream, a whim. At first, I thought his free spirit was refreshing. He would breeze in, full of stories about working in Birmingham cafes or trying to make it in New York, only to disappear again. With him, I never knew when I'd hear from him next. His visits were like shooting stars, rare, fleeting, and leaving me wishing for more. At first, I accepted the changes as part of growing up. Children have their own lives. They don't stay little forever, running into your arms and asking for biscuits after school. They become adults.
Fully closed. In the end, I learned to mask my disappointment. I nodded, I smiled, I handed over the money when asked. But inside, something shifted. A seed of doubt planted itself in my heart. If their love was so entangled with what I could give, what would happen when there was nothing left to offer? That question lingered, quietly gnawing at me, until the day I traveled to London and overheard a conversation that confirmed my deepest fear, a conversation that made it impossible to deny the truth any longer. It was Daniel who first invited me down to London. At the time, I thought perhaps things were beginning to shift back toward how they used to be. He rang me up one Thursday evening, his voice hurried as usual, but there was a note of sincerity, or so I believed. "Grandad," he said, "why don't you come down for the weekend? Stay with me, I'll show you around. It's been too long." My heart leaped at the offer. I hadn't been to London in years, not since Margaret and I had taken the grandchildren to the Natural History Museum when they were small. Back then, Daniel had held my hand as we walked beneath the towering skeleton of the blue whale, his eyes wide with wonder. To return now, at his invitation, felt like a chance to reclaim something that had slipped away. I packed my small suitcase with care, a clean shirt, my best trousers, and Margaret's old scarf, which I always carried when traveling. I boarded the train from Leeds, watching the countryside rush past, fields giving way to towns too, cities. The anticipation stirred inside me an odd blend of excitement and nerves, like I was about to see an old friend after far too long. When I arrived at King's Cross, Daniel was waiting, though not with the same eagerness I remembered from his childhood. He stood with his phone in hand, glancing at it every few seconds, offering me a quick hug before ushering me toward the underground. "Busy day, Grandad," he said, as though to excuse the clipped nature of our reunion, "but I'm glad you came." His flat was modern, sleek, the sort of place that looked like it had been pulled straight from a catalogue. Everything gleamed: countertops, glass tables, minimalist decor. It felt sterile, almost soulless, but Daniel seemed proud of it. We spent the evening together, though most of his attention remained tethered to his buzzing phone. I tried to ask about his work, his friends, his life in the city, but his answers were always half-hearted, as though his mind was elsewhere. Still, I told myself, at least we were together. The next day, he suggested we go out for dinner. "I'll invite Sophie too," he added. "She's in town for a few days." That news warmed me. I hadn't seen her in months, and the thought of having two of my grandchildren at the same table filled me with a joy I hadn't felt in a long while. We met at a restaurant near Canary Wharf, one of those trendy places where the waiters looked barely old enough to drive. Sophie arrived late, breathless, paint still smudged on her fingernails. She kissed me on the cheek and slid into the seat beside Daniel. For a while, things felt almost normal. We talked, we laughed, and I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the distance was closing. But then, as the evening wore on and the conversation turned, I heard words that pierced deeper than any silence ever could. It happened when I excused myself to the restroom. On my way back, I paused just outside the doorway, adjusting my scarf. That's when I heard them, Daniel and Sophie, their voices low, conspiratorial. "I just think we need to be patient," Daniel was saying. "He's old, Sophie, it won't be long." Sophie sighed. "I know, but what if he changes his will? What if he leaves it all to charity or something ridiculous? He's always talking about giving back." Daniel scoffed. "He wouldn't do that. He knows we're his family. Besides, I've already asked him for help with the investment. Once that pays off, I'll be set." My legs froze beneath me. The words hung in the air like shards of glass, cutting into me before I even had time to brace. Sophie's voice softened. "It just feels wrong, waiting like this. Wrong or not, Daniel replied, we'll get what's ours. He can't take it with him. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I considered stepping forward, confronting them, demanding to know if this was truly how they saw me, not as their grandfather, not as the man who once cradled them to sleep or dried their tears, but as a sum of possessions, a will to be executed. But I didn't, I couldn't. Instead, I turned back toward the restroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at my reflection in the mirror. The man who stared back looked older than I felt, wearier, broken in a way I hadn't been before. When I returned to the table, they smiled at me, the same practiced smiles I had seen during their visits. I forced myself to smile back though. Inside my chest, something had fractured. The rest of the meal passed in a blur. I don't remember what I ate, or what was said. I only remember the weight of their words, pressing down on me like a stone I couldn't shift. That night, back at Daniel's flat, I lay awake on the sofa bed, listening to the hum of the city outside. I thought of Margaret, of her boundless faith in people, of her insistence that love would always be enough. I wondered what she would say now, if she had heard what I had heard. Love them anyway, Elaine. I imagined her whispering, but for the first time, I wasn't sure if I could. The train ride back to Leeds the next day felt longer than it should have. I stared out the window, watching the scenery roll past, but I didn't see any of it. My mind replayed their voices over and over, like a record caught in a groove. He's old, it won't be long. He can't take it with him. By the time I stepped off at Leeds station, the world felt different. The quiet streets I had once found comforting now felt suffocating. My house, with its rows of daffodils blooming stubbornly by the garden path, felt lonelier than ever. For the first time, I understood that I wasn't simply forgotten. I was being waited on, waited out, like some inevitable conclusion they were eager to reach. It's one thing to be lonely. It's another entirely to realize that the people you love most are counting the days until you're gone. That truth settled into me like a stone at the bottom of a river, heavy and immovable. And yet, as painful as it was, it planted a seed of resolve, of determination to see the truth for what it was, to open my eyes fully rather than hiding behind excuses I didn't know it then. But that conversation in London was the turning point. From that day forward, nothing between my grandchildren and me would ever feel the same. After that trip to London, my heart felt heavier than it ever had before. For weeks, I replayed their voices in my head, Daniel's cold practicality, Sophie's uneasy complicity. The words dug deep. He's old. It won't be long. It was as if every quiet moment in my Leeds house echoed with those syllables, taunting me. I knew I couldn't sit still. The silence was too much, the weight too crushing. So, one grey morning, I did something uncharacteristic. I booked a short trip to Dublin. It wasn't planned. Not really. I'd always told Margaret we should go there, together, see the River Liffey, wander the cobbled streets, maybe hear some music in a real Irish pub. But life, as it often does, got in the way, and we never made it. So perhaps it was grief, or perhaps it was the need to breathe new air, to step away from Leeds and its ghosts for a little while. Either way, I packed a small bag, took my passport, and boarded a flight. Dublin greeted me with drizzle, the kind of soft rain that clings to your coat rather than soaking you. The city was alive with noise, buses rumbling past, laughter spilling out of cafes, the distant hum of a fiddle from some unseen pub. It felt vibrant, alive so, unlike the stillness of my house back in Leeds. I checked into a modest guest house near O'Connell Street. The receptionist, a young lad with freckles and a thick Irish accent, handed me my key with a smile that seemed genuinely warm. That small kindness alone lifted something inside me. It was that same evening, however, when my life took a turn I never expected. I had gone for a walk, wandering through the narrow streets lined with shops and pubs. My legs, not as strong as they once were, began to ache, so I stopped on a bench by the river. I must have sat there too long, because when I finally stood to head back, a sudden dizziness washed over me. My vision blurred, and the world tilted beneath my feet. The next thing I knew, a voice was calling, "Sir, are you all right?" I blinked, and found a young man crouched beside me, concern written across his face. He couldn't have been more than 30, with kind blue eyes and a mop of unruly brown hair. I think I just stood up too fast," I muttered, embarrassed by my weakness. "Let's get you some water," he said, helping me steady myself. His grip was firm but gentle, the kind of touch that says, "You're safe, I've got you." He guided me into a nearby cafe, bought me a glass of water, and sat with me until the dizziness passed. That was how I met Patrick O'Connor. We talked. That evening, two strangers thrown together by circumstance. He told me he lived just outside Dublin, worked in IT, but wasn't particularly passionate about it. He loved music, played the guitar, and volunteered at a local shelter on weekends. I found myself opening up to him more than I had with anyone in years. Perhaps it was the anonymity, the fact that he knew nothing of my past, nothing of my family, or perhaps it was simply his manner, attentive, genuine, without any trace of hurry or ulterior motive. When I mentioned I was traveling alone, his brow furrowed. "Well then, we'll have to make sure you see the best of Dublin while you're here," he said, and he meant it. Over the next few days, Patrick showed me parts of the city I might never have found on my own. We walked through Trinity College, where he insisted I see the Book of Kells. We strolled along Grafton Street, pausing to listen to buskers whose music filled the air with energy. One night, he even brought me to a small pub tucked away on a quiet street, where the locals gathered with fiddles and flutes, playing music that seeped into your bones. For the first time in a long while, I laughed freely. I felt alive, not as an old man waiting for the end, but as a person still capable of wonder. What struck me most about Patrick was his lack of agenda. He never asked for anything. He never hinted at money, never spoke as though he saw me as anything more than a fellow human being. Our conversations were about life, about dreams, about memories. I told him about Margaret, about my years as a postman, about the daffodils she used to plant each spring. He listened not out of politeness, but with genuine interest. One afternoon, as we sat by the river watching the water ripple beneath the bridges, he said something that stayed with me. "You know, sir, people often think family is about blood, but I've learned it's about who shows up for you, who cares enough to sit with you, even when there's nothing to gain." Those words sank deep. They echoed the very truth I had been too afraid to say aloud, that my own blood, my grandchildren, had stopped showing up, except when there was something to gain. And here was this young man, a stranger, offering me more care in a few days than they had in years. When my trip came to an end, Patrick insisted on escorting me back to the airport, "just to make sure you get on your flight all right," he said, with a grin. As we said goodbye, I felt a pang of sadness, but he surprised me. "Here," he said, scribbling his number on a scrap of paper, "give me a ring sometime, even if it's just for a chat. You've got a friend in Dublin." Now, I tucked that scrap into my wallet, alongside Margaret's photo. Back in Leeds, life resumed its familiar, quiet rhythm. But something was different, because every now and then, my phone would ring, and it would be Patrick, just to check in, just to ask how I was doing. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. There was no request, no hidden intentionally genuine care. It astonished me how much those calls meant. To know that someone thought of me, not for what I could give, but simply for who I was, it felt like water to parched soil. I began to realize that family could be found in unexpected places, that perhaps Margaret had been right all along. Love comes in many forms, and sometimes it arrives when you least expect it. Patrick's friendship was a gift I hadn't known I needed. It was the reminder that I wasn't invisible, that I still had value, not in terms of money or inheritance, but as a man with stories, with history, with life still left to live. And though I didn't know it yet, his presence in my life would soon become the very measure against which I weighed my grandchildren's actions, the test that revealed where true loyalty lies. The winter that followed my trip to Dublin was bitterly cold in Leeds, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, no matter how many blankets you pile on the bed. My house felt emptier than usual. Margaret's absence, the silence of a family that no longer cared, the echo of my own footsteps down the hallway. But amidst the chill, there was one small fire keeping me warm: Patrick's calls. Every week, sometimes twice a week, my phone would light up with his name. "All right, Elaine, how's the weather treating you?" he'd ask in that cheerful Dublin lilt. I'd smile, even before answering. We'd talk about everything: the daffodils that stubbornly pushed through the frost in my back garden, the football matches he went to with his mates, the songs he was trying to master on his guitar. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. But as life often does, it soon tested this fragile sense of hope. It started with a letter. A thick white envelope dropped through my letterbox one Thursday morning. The handwriting was neat but formal, not the scrawl of a grandchild. Writing out of love, my chest tightened as I slit it open. It was from Daniel. "Dear Grandad," it began, though even the word dear felt forced. He went on about how he hoped I was doing well, how Sophie and the kids missed me, how we should all reconnect as a family. My stomach twisted with unease. He ended with an invitation to join them in London for Christmas. I stared at the letter. For a long time, it had been years since they'd shown any genuine interest in me. Why now? Why Christmas? I didn't have to think hard to know the answer. They'd realized, perhaps through whispers, perhaps through assumptions, that the matter of inheritance still loomed. My silence, my distance, it must have unsettled them. And now, they were playing the part of loving family again, hoping to secure their place. The invitation gnawed at me. Part of me longed to believe it was genuine, that they had come to their senses, that maybe Margaret had whispered to them from heaven and softened their hearts. But another part, the larger part, remembered their voices that day in London. "He's old. It won't be long." That evening, when Patrick called, I told him about the letter. He listened quietly, letting me pour out my doubts. Then he said something simple. "Elaine, loyalty doesn't appear when money's on the table. It shows itself when there's nothing to gain." Those words struck me hard, because Patrick had given me nothing but loyalty without expectation, without reward. And yet, here were my grandchildren, returning only when they feared losing something. Still, I accepted their invitation. Not because I trusted them, but because I needed to know. I needed to see, with my own eyes, whether their words had changed, or whether their greed still ran deeper than their love. When Christmas came, I took the train to London. The city was draped in lights, shop windows filled with glittering decorations, carols echoing through the streets. But inside me, there was no carol, only the doldrum of suspicion. Daniel met me at the station, his smile too wide, his embrace too stiff. "Grandad, so glad you came," he said, as if we'd been close all along. Sophie stood nearby, offering a polite hug, her eyes flickering nervously. At their home, the tree was magnificent, the table set with precision. The children, my great-grandchildren, were excited to see me, but it was the excitement of novelty, not affection. They barely knew me. Dinner was pleasant on the surface. Laughter, clinking glasses, polite conversation. But underneath, I felt the tension, the careful choreography of people playing roles. Daniel asked too many questions about my health. Sophie steered the talk toward my house in Leeds. How it must feel too big for one man. How difficult it must be to maintain. I saw through it. Every word was a thread, weaving the same net. Inheritance, property, what would be left behind. When I returned to Leeds, I felt hollow. The trip had confirmed what I already knew. Their care was conditional. Their love was performance. And yet, the very next day, my phone rang. "How was it?" Patrick asked. I told him everything, the forced smiles, the questions about my health, the sly mentions of my house. "I'm sorry, Elaine," he said softly. "But at least now you know where you stand, and sometimes that knowledge is more valuable than false hope." His words steadied me. For the first time, I understood the true test of loyalty, not the grand gestures, not the seasonal invitations, but the everyday presence of someone who asks nothing in return. A few weeks later, fate tested me again, but this time, in a way, that left no room for doubt. I slipped on the icy pavement outside my house one January morning. My hip screamed with pain, and I couldn't get up. The cold bit into me as I lay there, helpless. Somehow, I managed to crawl back inside and dial for help. The hospital stay was short, but the recovery was long. The doctors told me to rest, to take it easy. And do you know who showed up? Not Daniel, not Sophie. Not once did they call or visit. But Patrick did. He crossed the Irish Sea, took a train from Holyhead to Leeds, and knocked on my door with a bag of groceries in one hand, and that same warm smile on his face. "I couldn't let you go through this alone," he said simply. For 2 weeks, he stayed with me, cooked meals, cleaned the kitchen, sat with me in the evenings as we watched old films. We talked, we laughed, sometimes we sat in silence, and never once did he mention money, never once did he hint at inheritance. His presence was pure loyalty, pure friendship. I realized then that Margaret had been right all along. Love isn't measured by blood, but by who shows up when you're in need. The test had been given, and the results were clear. My grandchildren had failed. Patrick had passed with flying colors, and in my heart I knew the decision about my will had already been made. That winter taught me more than years of family gatherings ever had. It taught me that loyalty reveals itself not in words, but in actions, that some people will only circle you like vultures, waiting for the moment you fall. But others, unexpected, unasked, will stand beside you, not because of what you can give, but because of who you are. Patrick was one of those rare souls, and though my grandchildren didn't know it yet, their ignorance, their neglect, had cost them everything. For me, the test of loyalty was over. The results would shape not only my final decisions, but the legacy I chose to leave behind. When you reach a certain age, there are conversations you can't avoid anymore. Doctors speak about preventive measures, neighbors whisper about funeral plans, and solicitors well. They ask the question that weighs heavier than all the others: who will inherit? For years, I had put off that decision. I told myself I'd deal with it when the time came. Margaret and I used to talk about it, back when we sat by the fire in this very house. She'd knit, I'd read, and now and then, she'd pause and say, "Elaine, when the time comes, make sure the right people get the right things. Don't let greed decide for you." Back then, I thought it was simple. Of course, everything would go to the grandchildren. That's what families do, isn't it? But life, as it turns out, is not simple. After my fall that winter, when Patrick came all the way from Dublin to take care of me, something shifted inside me. I would sit in my armchair, watching him boil the kettle or tidy up the sitting room, and I thought, this young man owes me nothing. He has no claim, no obligation. Yet he's here. Meanwhile, Daniel and Sophie, my own flesh and blood, didn't so much as ring the hospital. Their silence echoed louder than any words could. It was then that Margaret's words returned to me. Don't let greed decide for you. So one cold February morning, I put on my best coat, the one Margaret always said made me look a proper gentleman, and I took the bus into town. My destination, the office of Harrison & Co., solicitors, right there on Albion Street in Leeds. Mr. Harrison had known me for years. He'd handled small matters for Margaret and me: property, papers, insurance, things of that sort. He greeted me warmly, offered me tea, and then leaned back in his leather chair. "So, Mr. Elaine," he said, "are we finally putting things in writing?" I nodded, my hands trembling slightly. "Yes, I believe it's time." As we went through the paperwork, I felt an odd mix of relief and sorrow. Relief, because I was finally making a decision that had been hanging over me like a storm cloud. Sorrow, because it shouldn't have come to this. Family should be easy. Family should be the answer, not the problem. Mr. Harrison explained the options: how I could divide my estate, who I could include, how to ensure my wishes would be followed. "Do you want everything to go to your children and grandchildren, as is customary?" he asked. I paused. The words tasted bitter. Customary, traditional, expected. "No," I said firmly. "Not this time." I told him about Patrick, about how he had been there when no one else was, how he had shown kindness without condition, loyalty without agenda. I explained how my grandchildren, by contrast, had grown distant, reaching out only when they suspected inheritance was at stake. Mr. Harrison listened carefully, taking notes. "So, you'd like to make Patrick your primary beneficiary?" "Yes," I said, the decision solidifying in my chest. "Patrick will inherit the house, the savings, everything of real value. As for Daniel and Sophie, I'll leave them something, but not the whole of it. They don't deserve that." I thought long and hard about what something meant. In the end, I decided on keepsakes: family photographs, some of Margaret's jewelry, small tokens that carried memory but not wealth. Let them inherit the sentiment, the reminders of who we once were, but not the fruits of a loyalty they never gave. When I signed the papers, my hand shook not from doubt, but from the weight of the moment. I was choosing my legacy, shaping the story that would be told when I was gone. And though I knew it would anger them, though I knew there would be whispers of betrayal, I also knew it was the right thing. After all, love and loyalty cannot be bought, nor should they be rewarded when absent. That night, when Patrick rang, I didn't tell him outright. I simply said, "I sorted some important things today, lad. You've given an old man peace of mind." He didn't pry, he just said, "I'm glad, Elaine. That's all that matters." That's when I knew, beyond a shadow of a doubt, I'd made the right choice. because he wasn't asking, wasn't fishing. He didn't even suspect. His care for me wasn't about what he might gain, it was simply about being there. But my story doesn't end with the signing of papers. No, fate, as always, has its twists. Word somehow got back to Daniel. I don't know if Mr. Harrison's office leaked something, or if Daniel simply guessed. But a few weeks later, he rang me for the first time in months. "Grandad," he said with a forced cheer, "I was thinking we should come up to Leeds for a visit. The kids would love to see you." I nearly laughed at the sudden enthusiasm, but instead, I said, "That's kind of you, Daniel. Come if you wish." When they did visit, it was all too predictable. Sophie complimented the house. Daniel asked how I was managing the upkeep, and both tried to steer the conversation toward the future. I remained polite, but inside, I was screaming. They didn't see me. They only saw what I might leave behind. And as they drove away, waving from their car, I felt strangely calm, because I no longer had to question, no longer had to wrestle with guilt. The decision had been made. The papers were signed. Patrick would inherit not because I wanted to punish my grandchildren, but because he had earned it through something far rarer than blood, genuine love. In the weeks that followed, I often found myself standing in the garden, staring at the daffodils Margaret used to adore. They were bright against the dull Yorkshire sky, stubborn little things pushing through frost and rain. They reminded me of Patrick, unassuming, steady, bringing warmth in the coldest times. And I thought, this is what legacy should be. Not about money or property, but about leaving the world to someone who will tend it with care. For the first time in years, I felt peace. I had honored Margaret's words, and I had honored my own heart. The decision was made, and there was no turning back. That night, I sat by the fire, pen in hand, and began writing letters, one for Daniel, one for Sophie, and one for Patrick. Letters they would one day open, after I was gone. To my grandchildren, I wrote honestly but gently. I told them I loved them once, that I still wished them happiness, but that love must be shown, not spoken, and because they had failed to show it, I could not leave them what they expected. To Patrick, I wrote with gratitude. Gratitude for his laughter, his kindness, his presence when I needed it most. I told him he had become the grandson I never truly had. When I sealed those letters, I felt lighter than I had in years, because at last, my story had found its direction. And though my grandchildren would one day call it betrayal, I knew the truth. It was justice. There are moments in life you can prepare for and still never truly be ready to face. The day of my will's revelation was one of those. I had thought about it countless times, how Daniel and Sophie would react, what words they'd use, whether they'd shed tears of sorrow or tears of anger. But thinking about it in the quiet of my sitting room and actually living it, those are two entirely different things. It all happened sooner than I expected. On a damp Tuesday morning in Leeds, I was sitting by the window with a cup of tea when my solicitor, Mr. Harrison, rang. His voice was calm, professional, but I could hear a trace of hesitation. "Mr. Elaine," he began, "as per your instructions, I have now finalized the official copy of your will. I thought it best to inform you that your grandson Daniel requested a meeting with me last week. He seemed rather curious about the arrangements." I let out a weary sigh. Curious, was he? I imagine he was more than that. I didn't disclose anything, of course, Mr. Harrison assured me, but I suspect he senses the direction of things. I thanked him and hung up. My hands trembled slightly as I placed the phone back on its cradle. It was happening. The storm I had tried to avoid all these years was finally rolling in. Sure enough, 2 days later, Daniel and Sophie arrived at my door unannounced. Their knock was sharp, hurried, almost impatient. When I opened the door, Daniel plastered on a smile far too wide to be sincere. "Grandad, thought we'd drop by again. You know, check in on you." Sophie chimed in, her voice sugar-coated. "Yes, it's been too long. And besides, I've been dying to hear about how you're managing things on your own." One invited them in, because I'm not the sort of man to turn family away at the door. But as they sat on my sofa, I could see it in their eyes, the calculation, the silent questions. We exchanged pleasantries, but it wasn't long before Daniel cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Grandad," he said, voice tinged with forced casualness, "I heard you've been in touch with Harrison and Co. lately, sorting things out." I stirred my tea slowly, giving myself a moment. "That's right. A man my age needs to put his affairs in order. Sophie gave a quick glance at her brother, then back at me. Of course, it's only sensible. We care about you, and we want to make sure everything's handled properly. Handled properly. The words stung. They weren't here for me. They were here for what I represented: a bank account, a house, a list of assets. I set my cup down carefully and looked at them both. You'll find, when the time comes, that everything is indeed handled. But you may not like the way it's handled. Their faces faltered, just for a moment. Daniel tried to mask his frustration, but his voice sharpened. What do you mean by that? I didn't answer. Some truths need no explanation. Weeks later, the inevitable day arrived. Mr. Harrison had arranged for a formal reading of the will, as was tradition. I sat in his office, a heavy oak table between us, the room smelling faintly of leather and old books. Daniel and Sophie were there, their postures stiff, their eyes darting toward me with suspicion and impatience. And then Patrick walked in. The air shifted instantly. Daniel's jaw tightened, Sophie's brows knit together. They knew, they didn't need to hear a word. They could feel the ground shifting beneath them. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat and began reading. His voice was steady, almost clinical, but every word landed like a stone in the still water of the room. I left small items to Daniel and Sophie: photo albums, Margaret's old locket, a set of books that had belonged to their great-grandfather. And then came the part that silenced the room. To my dear friend Patrick O'Donnell, who has shown me loyalty, kindness, and companionship in the years when I needed it most, I leave the entirety of my estate, including my house in Leeds, and the remainder of my savings. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel's face turned crimson. "What?" he shouted, leaping to his feet. "You can't be serious, Grandad. You're leaving everything to him, a stranger." Sophie's voice cracked with disbelief. "We're your family, your blood. How could you do this to us?" I sat calmly, though my heart was pounding. "Family," I said quietly, "is more than blood. It's about who stands by you when the world falls apart. And when I was lying in a hospital bed, it wasn't either of you who came. It was Patrick." Daniel's fists clenched. "So this is punishment, because we didn't drop everything to rush to your side." I looked him straight in the eye. "It's not punishment. It's recognition." Patrick gave freely, without expecting anything in return. That's why he deserves this. You gave nothing but silence. Sophie's eyes welled with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of hurt or rage. Perhaps both. After the meeting, they stormed out, slamming the office door behind them. Their anger lingered in the air long after they'd gone. Patrick sat quietly, almost stunned. Finally, he turned to me, his voice soft. "Elaine, I don't know what to say. I never expected this." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "That's exactly why you deserve it. You never expected, you never asked. You simply were there." His eyes glistened, and for the first time in years, I felt a warmth that reminded me of Margaret, the warmth of being truly seen, truly valued. In the days that followed, Daniel and Sophie sent angry letters, filled with accusations of betrayal and injustice. They even threatened legal action, though I knew the will was airtight. But their anger no longer pierced me. I had made peace with my choice. I had honored the truth of my life, not the expectations of others. I spent more time with Patrick after that. We tended the garden together, shared meals, and even planned small trips. He treated me not as a burden, not as a bank account, but as a man, a grandfather, a friend. And as the seasons changed, as daffodils bloomed once again in the garden Margaret once loved, I realized something profound. I had not lost a family. I had found one. In the end, that's what legacy truly is. Not the money, not the property, not the possessions. Legacy is about leaving your world, your love, your story, in the hands of someone who will honor it. My grandchildren may never forgive me, but that no longer matters. For the first time in many years, I chose not with guilt, not with fear, but with clarity. And when my time comes, I'll leave this world, knowing the right person holds the key to my home, my memories, and my heart. Not because of blood, but because of